Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this first lecture of 2024 for our Great Books program. This is one of my favorite courses at Ubiquity, which I co-developed with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Georgie Szabo, for our graduate students on some of the great works of human history. So over the years now, we've dealt with books, ancient and modern, East and West, North and South, in all kinds of genres. We've invited various guest lecturers to join us to talk about the book that has moved them most deeply in their lives. And as we have noted over the years, you know, what makes a book great are several factors. In the first instance, great books, whatever the genre, deal with issues having to do with human nobility, the complexity of human life, ethics, in a way that challenge people across cultures to think more deeply and feel more deeply about the human condition. You know, great books are also powerfully transformational. You think, for example, of the Bible or the Tao Te Ching from China or the Quran. You know, books have a capacity to move entire cultures, to create religions, to mobilize armies, and to both end and begin whole eras of human thought and achievement. You know, great books really are an encounter with intelligences not our own. We often think of intelligence as something that's biologic, but it can also be a book sitting in a dusty drawer that you pick up that hasn't been opened for hundreds of years, and then somehow you are addressed in a very deep part of your psyche and heart and can't put the book down. You know, the Salvation Army was generated out of someone who came across a Bible in a hotel room and was so moved by what he wrote that he changed his life. And he started the Salvation Army. And there's countless stories over the eons of time of great books. You know, and you think of the first book really written back in ancient Mesopotamia, you know, 2600 BC, the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest texts in the world. One thinks of the I Ching that was already ancient at the beginnings of China's ancient civilization about the same time. You know, books that have endured for thousands and thousands of years. And then you think of Harry Potter, that just burst into public consciousness with an extraordinary force. 7 books in a row, written, almost channeled, that captivated young people and have been perennial bestsellers ever since. You know, in some books, they rise and they fall and they are fascinating for a certain very short period of time, and then they fade away and are completely forgotten. You know, no one really understands why or how this all happens. But what we've been trying to do with Ubiquity in this book, the great books, is to really share with you, our graduate students and the wider public. This is the one course in our curriculum that is open to the public. And so we're very delighted. And for the next 2 months, I want to delve back in to my favorite philosopher after Plato, Friedrich Nietzsche, and delve into his masterwork, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. One of the most influential books in my life, and one that I have cherished for many, many years. I've taught it before, a number of years ago, but when we were contemplating books for this year, Georgie advised me to pick a classic that was very close to my heart. So I pondered, should it be the Tao Te Ching? Should it be the Bhagavad Gita from the East? Should it be Dune, Frank Herbert's Dune? I've never taught Dune. Maybe next year I'll delve into Dune. That was a kind of an explosive book in my consciousness. The foundations of Tibetan mysticism. It's an extraordinarily powerful book in my life. I've been, as an academic, as a recovering intellectual, I love books, and I'm always reading one or more books. I have one here at the office that I read. I have one in my apartment that I read. I've been devouring, actually, every book that I can possibly come across, and all the videos I can watch on the UFO phenomenon. Now that I'm back in Washington, working with the New Paradigm Institute, although I can continue to be president of Ubiquity and continue to work, with the Chartres Academy and work with Georgie and on the doctoral dissertations and so forth. So, but I've been consuming books on the UFO phenomenon just to educate myself about what's going on in the world. So today I want to begin our exploration of Nietzsche, the great German philosopher of the late 19th century. Lived from 1844, died in 1900, very brief life, tormented by pain, sickness, mental anguish, a sense of futility about his personal capacity to attract a wife and partner, and yet someone who, through it all, as they say in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament about Jesus, that he learned obedience through what he suffered. That was Friedrich Nietzsche. So today, what I'd like to do in the next hour, and then we're going to have to close this session after only 60 minutes rather than 90 minutes, because I have another engagement that I have to get to, but I'll try to make it up next time. I want to review the life of Nietzsche so that we can set a context for who he was and the time in which he was born and lived out his days, because it was in an extraordinary moment in the development of Western civilization. He was born to a middle-class family. His father was a Lutheran minister in 1844 in a small town in Prussia. At that time, Germany was not a country, a unified country. There was Prussia, and there was Saxony, and there were various princely kingdoms that were amalgamated in that part of Europe. Many of the countries that we know today in Europe, Italy, for example, wasn't a unified country. So when you think of Nietzsche's beginnings, think of Europe as an amalgamation of some countries, France, for example, Great Britain, but even France hadn't reached its present-day borders. So there was a lot of ambiguity. You think of a time in history where you didn't need a passport. You just traveled. You ended up wherever you ended up. And that was Nietzsche's upbringing. His mother, his father's wife, was a typical minister's wife. I know that because my father was a missionary and my mother was his devoted wife. And so Nietzsche grew up in that context. Although when he was only 4 years old, his father died of a brain tumor that caused him great anguish and pain for the last year of his life. So little Friedrich lost his father at a very early age, and then ended up living with his mother and his sister, with various relatives, ending up living at his grandmother's house until he went to school. He was a fairly bright student, but wasn't particularly motivated to get good grades. And one time when he was in high school, he went out with a friend and came home drunk. And that caused a scandal in this little Lutheran village. That little Friedrich, his friend, would get inebriated and contravene the strictures of righteousness in that little German town. And then he went off to university with every intent of following in his father's footsteps and becoming a minister. And while he was at university, I think it was 20 years old, he read Ludwig Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity, which I read in my 20s, and was one of the most challenging and scintillating books that I read. It was while I was at Harvard, actually, studying Christology. I read Feuerbach and Bultmann, these great German theologians. And it was Feuerbach who was the first theologian in the history of Christianity to challenge the notion that has been developed as the orthodoxy of Christianity, that the Gospels were divinely inspired and that Jesus was the incarnation of God and part of the Trinity, and the Nicene Creed, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, born of the virgin birth, et cetera, who died for our sins. And Feuerbach said, that's all a mythological formulation. It actually didn't happen. And that Christianity is a construct that was made by a community over time. And that if you begin to look at the four Gospels, for example, you see that the Gospel of Mark was clearly the earliest, and that Luke and Matthew and even John were derivative, so that And rather than this notion of, Moses and the Ten Commandments and God inspiring the particular gospel writer and, writing it, sort of in a single sitting as divinely inspired truth, that these books were comparative, they were synaptic. And in fact, if you look at them, there's major areas of disagreement. And if you look at the ways in which Matthew and Luke, for example, differ in the genealogy of Jesus, Matthew tracing it through Solomon, and Luke tracing it through another son of David. What's true? When little Friedrich Nietzsche read that book as he was starting university, it exploded all his belief systems. And in a very dramatic and almost instantaneous way, he denied his Christianity, gave up being a minister, and even denounced his Prussian citizenship and remained stateless for the rest of his life, even though later in his life, he, during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to 1872, he joined the Prussian army as a medic. But this will give you a sense of a dramatic occurrence at a very young age. And it's important to remember that this was the time when Charles Darwin was enunciating the theory of evolution. So you had the beginnings in Germany of radical, what Rudolf Bultmann was to call radical demythologization of the scriptures, and the beginnings courageously by the German theological community of what they call redaction criticism, looking at the biblical texts as just books through the scientific prism of literary criticism. And this was revolutionary, absolutely revolutionary. And Nietzsche, imbibing Darwin's theory of evolution and the shocking revelation that humans weren't put on earth, created by God, on Saturday after 6 days of creation, but they evolved over millions and millions of years. And they've descended from the apes. I mean, it's hard for us because we take it for granted to fathom the impact of Darwin and Feuerbach on Western intellectual development, which for 2,000 years had been encased in Christian orthodoxy, a literal interpretation of the Bible, a belief codified over time in various creeds that was believed so strongly that if you didn't adhere to the last jot and tittle, you could be burned at the stake. And hundreds of thousands of heretics were burnt, women as witches, Inquisition to enforce this dogma. And all of a sudden in the 19th century, second half of the 19th century, it all exploded. That impacted Nietzsche's mind. So the first thing I want to say about Nietzsche is that he brought to a close the Western philosophical tradition. he exploded it. That was the genius of Nietzsche. There's been no philosophy, really, since Nietzsche, because nobody's been able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So we talk about postmodernism and all of that, and until we've got Ken Wilber with integral theory and integral philosophy that's may have put most of Humpty Dumpty back together again, but not in the kind of harmonious way that endured from Plato onward. And I think it was fundamentally because Nietzsche understood the death of God. He was the first one to coin the term. That it shattered the frail vessel of his body. You know, sometimes people pay a great price for truth. And in fact, one of his initial aphorisms, he was very famous for his aphorisms, was part of a letter that he wrote to his sister after reading Feuerbach. And he said, I've come to realize that if you want peace of soul, believe. If you want truth, then inquire. And for the rest of his life, Friedrich Nietzsche inquired. And that really was the genesis of the transformation of a frail, somewhat confused, ordinary student into a brilliant genius that was considered a prodigy while he was at university. And by the time he was 24 years old, even though he hadn't gotten his doctorate yet, which he never ended up finishing, he was invited to the University of Basel in Switzerland to be the professor of philology. That's really the study of languages. And he went there and he lectured and was brilliant, had a fascination and a love for the Greeks. But then when he was only 34 years old, he resigned from the university because of the debilitation of his illnesses had made teaching completely untenable. He was susceptible to migraine headaches. He got colds all the time. He was very nearsighted and can barely read. His writing was all kind of close and scribbly. He could get disoriented. And that's something to bear in mind when you think of, when you read Nietzsche. It's not like reading Kant. It's not like reading Hegel, who can sustain a thought for like 25 pages, as only the Germans could do. Nietzsche's fractalized. And that's why his philosophy and his writings are mostly a sequence of aphorisms with a thread, but with a meandering of the psyche and intelligence that doesn't lead one, as envelops one in a series of brilliant insights that one can ponder for days, and they're only a sentence long. That's Nietzsche. So the relationship between his physical frailty and the explosive impact of the great thinkers of his age contributed, after only about 10 years as a professor, to breaking his body down to such an extent that he resigned. Then he went to Italy and began an itinerant life at various sanatorium where people go to take the waters and just relax by lakes, or to take the hot baths in the springs, and so forth and so on. And then in 1882, when he was 38 years old, he had the experience of his life. He was traveling with a friend of his called Paul Ray, and was introduced to the most beautiful woman imaginable, the 21-year-old Russian femme extraordinaire, the Lou Salome. Intellectually gifted, exceedingly beautiful, socially vivacious, curious, everything that Friedrich Nietzsche was not, except in the brilliance of their minds. And instantly and completely, Nietzsche fell completely in love with her. They began to travel together as a threesome. Their utopian dream was to find someplace, probably in Italy, where they could set up a writers' colony and live in a community and have meals together and speak to the great issues of their time, and engage in the deep work of understanding the new era that was dawning upon humanity, channeling itself through Western civilization as the scientific enlightenment began to truly take hold on the Western mind. Over the course of about a year and a half, Nietzsche proposed 3 times to Lou Salome, and 3 times she rejected his advances. And after the 3rd time, she and Paul Ray left and didn't tell Nietzsche that they were going. And he woke up the next day and they were gone. And he descended into a chasm of depression from which he never fully recovered. One of the reasons for the breakup was his own sister, Elizabeth, who was jealous of Lou and felt that because she was so vivacious and so she was so socially adroit, that she must be an immoral woman and not suitable for the great genius that everyone recognized that Friedrich was. So there was deep enmity between Nietzsche and his sister, but because he was so broken, he needed her. And so there was a deep ambivalence in his life, and he went to one sanatorium after another, just seeking solace in his soul. He ended up in northern Italy at a little town called Rapallo by a beautiful, beautiful lake. And there he began to find peace. And one day, as he was walking alone by the lake, taking in the air, taking in the scenery, all of a sudden, a great voice burst in his head and declared, "I am Zarathustra." Right. And Nietzsche was so altered that, as he recounted later, he saw in his inner psyche a great round stone. And hardly able to see and completely overcome by the ecstasy of this encounter with the numinous, with the holy, he stumbled back to his cabin and in the next 10 days wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra, his great work. He completed half of it in those 10 days. And it was only later that he completed the second half, also in a frenzy of ecstasy and inspiration, and in about another 10 days. It was with his encounter with Zarathustra that Nietzsche delivered his greatest work. And when you read it, you can feel through the terseness of the language, the clarity of the aphorisms, the momentum of the text, that this was not Nietzsche writing. This was Zarathustra using Nietzsche as a pen. We'll delve into this masterwork next time, but I want to conclude by just reminding us who was Zarathustra. Zarathustra was the great avatar and teacher of ancient Persia. He was the origin, intelligence of the Axial age, the oldest of the avatars. One thinks of Buddha and Mahavira and Lao Tzu in ancient China between the 6th and 5th centuries BC. One thinks of Pythagoras, the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus, in the West, what Karl Jaspers called the Axial age, standing before Zarathustra, who was a young man in the court, the king of Persia, which at that time was consumed by ritual. It's very important as we understand human intellectual history to understand what's recorded in the Iliad, in the Odyssey, in the Vedas, that the origins of religion and spirituality in the beginnings of human pre-civilizational thought and development, there wasn't a well-developed notion of individual morality. Everything was subsumed into ritual, how to please the gods through the right sacrifices on the right days with the right intonations of ritualistic language to make sure that the great invisible forces that buffeted all of nature, including humankind, could be appeased. Zarathustra, who was the first to gain the insight that the ultimate determinant of blessing and curse may have something to do with the larger cosmic forces that envelop us, that shape us. But the final arbiter of these matters is human judgment, human action, and that the morality of the universe is played out on the anvil in the human heart. So Zarathustra stands across history, in some ways at the beginning of human theological and spiritual reflection as it began to enter into the epic, out of the shamanic, out of the Great Mother, into both the achievements and the tragedies of human civilization. Zarathustra said that in this context, the fundamental truth is you. And depending on how you act, what you think, what you say, you determine not only your own fate, but you help to shape the cosmic reality within which you find yourself. And if you think of all the great religions, in one way or another, they grapple with this reality. It's extraordinary that right at the moment when Nietzsche could see that the Western philosophical and theological traditions were no longer relevant in a scientific age. Zarathustra, the primordial intelligence, would enter his psyche in the depths of his agony, where his heart was broken. And through those cracks, a new light shone. So I think I'll leave it there for now. But that'll be some of my preliminary thoughts on this great genius. And then next time we'll dive into the text of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And there's Georgie, who by tradition always makes the first comment on these matters. So Georgie,
thank you,
speak to us. What do you think?
Thank you. Thank you so much for your brilliant expose and introduction to Nietzsche's book. I really love this book. But before I make my comments, first of all, Happy New Year to everybody. So great to see familiar, not faces, rather names. Hope you're all well, and it's great to start the year with you all. Maybe just a few words on your points of view on the great books. To me, great books where I can see myself within the book, where I can feel some relatedness, anything that touches my soul and heart. Of course, not every single book does that, but I do know that there are those ones such as this book, and I'm so happy that you have chosen this one. And you're brilliant on Nietzsche. You're brilliant on all the things you lecture on. I didn't actually know about Friedrich Nietzsche's private life, and the way you were talking, I could almost see as a little trailer for a mini series on Netflix about Cool. And when you said that little Friedrich Nietzsche, it's like, oh, that's so sweet. So yeah, I think he was ahead of his time, wasn't he? Because the way he speaks about so important aspects of our becoming, because that's what he was talking about. He is you would say that it's so relevant today, not like it was like 120, 130 years ago. And so many times when I read his book, I always thought that he was so deeply spiritual, although he never said that. Absolutely not. But the way he speaks about everything is constant change. You find your own path, you find your own truth. The famous ubermensch concept in his book, right? That your highest potential, your higher potential. And I think he influenced so many great thinkers, such as Ayn Rand, because Ayn Rand said as well that, you know, people don't like looking up. People don't like looking up to those who are a bit more evolved. And that's what Nietzsche is saying, that that's the Ubermensch, the overman, that when you are higher, you know, you look down. People like looking down much more than looking up, because they know within themselves that they have the potential. But to go through that hardship, and that we all have to go through, that super strong, heavy storm that Jung said that you have to go through it. So these are the reasons I know that we will talk about it more next time in February, go more into it. But I think it's so relevant, as I said before, what he's been written, and he really suffered a lot. But isn't it that most geniuses, they suffered so much, and maybe through that suffering emerged that phoenix of wisdom and knowledge that really influenced and karmically influenced hundreds and thousands of people. And yeah, this is a masterpiece indeed. I love when he's really dissecting the will to power and what it is like, how you actually find that within yourself. And I really would like to quiz you about, and maybe this is a longer talk, about what freedom means to Nietzsche, and then what you understand. I really would like to know that, because what Nietzsche says is that when you really establish or embody that will within, that you have power over yourself. That is freedom. But I think there is so much more to it. I don't know if you have time to discuss it. I would love to have your take on it.
No, you're raising, Georgie, a very important issue that was at the heart of his thinking, and for which he's been heavily criticized by lesser minds. And one of his he wrote a number of famous books, but one of them was called Beyond Good and Evil.
Yeah.
And what he was saying is that if you understand that Christianity is now collapsing as a guardian of morality because what they've been telling us isn't true, what that implies is, he said, if you look back on Christian history, the people that allowed themselves to become subservient to Christian doctrine that was articulated more for power purposes to keep people under control. He says the Christians, the Jews and the Christians, and of course the Muslims, the Abrahamic religions, were masters at cultivating what he called the slave morality.
Mm-hmm.
So be meek, turn the other cheek, walk another mile in the other person's moccasins, love them that hate you, do good to them that despitefully use you, keep all the rules of the Sabbath, be sure to keep all the sexual taboos because you don't want to engage in any kind of real sexuality. Life is drudgery, but if you stay a slave, a happy slave, you get to go to heaven when you die. So Nietzsche was saying that at the heart of the ubermensch, which is the term ubermensch, the super person, is what came through with Zarathustra and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So I'm going to say a lot about it next time. But everyone who wrestles with the inherited tradition within which they've been enchained and breaks out. I mean, we just had an amazing oral dissertation from one of our star students, Michelle Blair.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of Nietzsche and Zarathustra during her defense of her. Here's this woman in Texas, everybody, evangelical redneck Texas, who doesn't lose track of her essential freedom and allowed the suffering that she experienced because of her refusal to submit to the slave morality, to carve out in her a larger vessel of what Jung would call divine conflict, what he called the crucifixion of the ego, out of which comes an expression of freedom that is really the gateway to, as Nietzsche would say, to discovering who you actually are. We are not here to be good Christians. We are here to be authentic human beings and to sacrifice everything at the altar of freedom. Because if you aren't willing to do that, you're not honoring this ephemeral moment called your life. And so this notion of freedom, but it has to be balanced. And part of the tragedy of anyone on the path, part of the tragedy of Nietzsche is he ended up in the last 10 years of his life in an insane asylum because he couldn't keep it all together and had to be taken by his family, his mother, who was still alive, and then his sister, till his mother died, and then his sister took care of him till the end of his days when he died in 1900. So the pathway to freedom is not an easy one. It's one with a high casualty rate, but one, if you're willing to tread it with the discipline of practice and focused intent can liberate you. And the prize is the expression of who you truly are and why you were born in this moment for a purpose that you're here to actually discover. So that question of freedom is at the heart of Zarathustra's teachings, and I'll explore it more through the prism of Nietzsche next time. But I see that Jonathan Harvey has his hand up. So Jonathan, let's see here. I will allow to talk, and you can promote the panelists. So Jonathan, would love to have you comment or make any question that you would like before we close.
I had two comments, neither of which is a question. One of which is some of the ideas that you're attributing to Ludwig Feuerbach, I had the impression were actually from David Friedrich Strauss in his book, The Life of Jesus Critically Examined. My father published a book on Feuerbach. He started off deciding to write a book as a comparative study of Feuerbach and Nietzsche. And then he changed his mind and decided to make it only a book on Feuerbach. But I'm pretty sure those are ideas from Strauss, not Feuerbach. The other thing I want to say is I want to strongly recommend an absolutely first-rate film called Twilight of the Gods. The film is a 90-minute conversation between the ghost of Richard Wagner and Friedrich Nietzsche in his asylum cell. And it's just the two characters running for 90 minutes. It's written and directed by Julian Doyle, who began his career as a film editor for Monty Python. In fact, if you've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, you know how it ends with the police shutting down the movie, and the final shot is a policeman putting his hand over the camera. And the policeman who puts his hand over the camera is the writer and director of this film, Twilight of the Gods, which I find an interesting connection. But I do highly recommend that movie.
Well, thank you. And thank you for bringing in Strauss and his life of Jesus, because that was part of it. And I don't mean to make Feuerbach the exclusive reservoir of this. This was more of a movement where people like Strauss and Feuerbach and others participated in it in Germany at that time, and in which Nietzsche was caught up. But Strauss was very much in that, and they were interactive, and Hegel was also part of that discussion. Kant in his own way. It was a time of deep and widespread intellectual foment in Germany, which at that time was really in the forefront of Western intellectual debate and development. So thank you for bringing that up. And I think I saw Twilight of the Gods many, many, many years ago, but on the strength of this recommendation from you, I think I'll see if it's on Netflix, or I guess you could just Google it. I'm sure it's
on Amazon Prime.
It's at Amazon Prime. Cool.
Or at least it was when I watched it. Sometimes these things disappear from Amazon.
Yeah, they
can't
come and they kind of go.
It's still there.
So thank you very much. So that'll be everybody's homework.
Okay. I suppose one other note. I work as a math tutor, and I find this fascinating because I work as a math tutor. But apparently, Friedrich Nietzsche was the top student in his class at his high school, except he was failing math. And the rules of his high school were that he could not graduate unless he passed math. And it looked like nothing was going to ever get him to pass math. And the board of directors of his high school or gymnasium voted to pass a resolution to give Friedrich Nietzsche a special pass, that he wasn't going to have to pass mathematics to graduate, since he was absolutely the very top student in every other subject.
Yeah. Thank you.
As a math tutor, I find that quite interesting.
Well, as someone who barely passed math myself and had to take bonehead math in order to complete my university studies, I'm always have been deeply sympathetic to Nietzsche. Sometimes the philosophical mind finds mathematics a little bit constraining.
Good, but Pythagoras was the first person in history to call
Totally.
himself a philosopher.
Well, yeah, that was a true avatar, man. So thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Georgie. Thank you, everyone. I apologize that we've got to keep it a little bit short today, but I'll try to make up for it next time. And we'll see you on the second Tuesday of February. And we'll go into the text of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Right.